This court is now in order. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, members of the court, please stand for the invocation of protection. Prayer to Freja. Hear me, Freja, bless me your protection with Kaiwas and Tharisats. Hunt these cowards that dare threaten me and the truth of this court. Terrify and toy with them, just as cats do with their prey. Fly on falcon wings, my lady, eviscerate them all. May those who threaten be forever tortured in your hall. Seal this invocation, Freya. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, please be seated. The Honorable Court of the Cosmic Truth is now in session, and we begin the proceedings. My dear esteemed viewer, I have for your consideration the evidence of Jesus the sorcerer, Jesus and magic, accusations of magic. I will present to you now the 3 traits that were known, that were said to signify and mark the one who practiced these sorceries in the days of old. The evildoer, the malefici, the one who is doing evil, men who are doing evil. I have presented to you thus far historical information from various sources, pagan, Jewish, Talmudic law, the behavior of the magician, as such is what is now presented to you, my dear esteemed viewer. Namely, his self-imposed secrecy against the suspiciously secretive behavior that Jesus presented within the gospel. To this very day, this information is there for your consideration. I want to ask you, my dear, esteemed, and honorable viewer, was Jesus possessed? Possessed or possessor? Exploring the relationship between Jesus and his spiritual gnosis within the Gospels, his power, if you will. Morton Smith and Stephan Davy stand firmly at opposing ends of the theoretical and semantic spectrum with regard to their understanding of Jesus' relationship with the Holy Spirit. Stephan Davies proposes that Jesus was possessed by the Spirit, and therefore he should be recognized as a spirit-possessed healer. On the other hand, Morton Smith argues that Jesus was the dominant controlling force in the relationship, and consequently he had possession of the Spirit. Smith's theory is deeply unpalatable for Davies, who outlines the disagreement as follows, and I quote, "It was not the relationship, possession of, but the relationship, possession by. The fundamental difference being whether the identity of Jesus of Nazareth was thought to be in control of a spirit entity, or whether the identity of Jesus of Nazareth was sometimes thought to have been replaced by a spirit entity. And that makes all the difference in the world. By elevating the passivity of the individual undergoing a possession experience and emphasizing the dominant role of the new persona, Davies' theory limits the degree of control that Jesus held in the subsequent application of his power and guards against the possibility that he was exerting control over a spirit through the use of magic. However, a brief analysis of the central characteristics of spirit possession that are repeatedly cited in both ancient and modern studies into this phenomenon swiftly reveals that Davies' spirit-possessed healer is a highly improbable epithet for the Jesus of the Gospels, and that it is Smith's argument that is closer to the mark. Spirit possession, the divided self, and the strange soul, what Dolores Cannon would refer to as a walk-in soul. T.K. Osterreich comments in his substantial volume, Possession and Exorcism, a study of possession in both Christian and non-Christian contexts, that the concept of possession loses its relevance as cultures begin to abandon their belief in spiritual being. Although the practice of divine possession is still advocated in our current religious climate by many Christian charismatic groups, a gradual disregard for the existence of spiritual bodies in our present-day culture clearly accounts for our generally dismissive attitude towards possession and our tendency to assign it to inferior or irrational forms of thinking. Thus, we are inclined to associate spirit possession with either the anthropological study of primitive ritual or psychological disturbances belonging to the psychiatric school of mental illness, or we simply reduce it to the harmless and entertaining genre of the Hollywood shocker movie. Since the reality of demonic influences was widely recognized in antiquity, possession was much more commonplace amongst the ancients, and cases were treated with genuine caution. It is within this cultural framework of spirit possession that Stefan Davies suggests that we can understand the relationship between Jesus and the Holy Spirit. Davies attempts to demonstrate that Jesus suffered from psychological episodes in which his original persona, Jesus of Nazareth, was subordinated. Of course, as in an earlier video, I demonstrated that Nazareth was not a place name, a geographical locale, but referred to the Essene sect that was located in Nassar. Excuse me. Strike that from the record, Judge, thank you. Was subordinated or replaced by a new temporary persona, the Spirit of God. During these possession episodes, Davies claims that Jesus was able to operate as a spirit-possessed healer. However, he should not be identified as himself, but as another person, the Spirit of God. A deviation from or replacement of the natural personality of an individual is generally considered to be a major indication of spirit possession. A change in personality is generally considered to result from either the temporary loss of the practitioner's normal persona or soul, hence the anthropological term soul loss, or the temporary possession of the practitioner by an external supernatural power. It is most often the case that both changes occur simultaneously and the soul is replaced immediately by another. Osterreich observed that in a state of typical possession, the normal and possessing personas cannot simultaneously exist alongside one another, and so the original persona is replaced, the result of which is as follows, and I quote, "The subject considers himself as the new person and envisages his former being as quite strange, as if it were another. The statement that possession is a state in which side by side with the first personality, a second has made its way into the consciousness is also very inaccurate. It is the first personality which has been replaced by a second." In accordance with this type of possession behavior, Davies proposes that the observation of the people in Mark chapter 3, verse 21, that he is beside himself, literally means that Jesus was absent from himself. This phrase, therefore, is evidence that Jesus was possessed by an external entity in this instant. To support this possession theory, Davies examines Jesus' reported behavior in the Gospels and isolates passages in which he believes that Jesus is demonstrating typical traits of possession behavior. Studies of both demonical and divine possession have identified a set of common behavioral patterns that are associated with the individual undergoing a possession experience. The first indication of possession is a change to the speech of the possessed, and it is not uncommon in both ancient and modern reports of possession to encounter reference to an alternative persona speaking in the first person through the patient, or an alteration in speech patterns, pitch, or timbre. In light of this, Davies directs his readers to Mark chapter 13, verse 11. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit, and suggests that this passage deals directly with alter persona spirit speech, in which the words are not formulated by the individual himself, but originate from the new dominant persona that has acquired control of the speech of its host. A second archetypal indication of possession is an increase in motor movement, known as motor hyperexcitement. When the possessing spirit replaces the original persona of the host, it often takes control of the motor movements of the individual, thus exhibiting observable behavioral and psychological irregularities. Evidence of the physical symptoms of possession and Jesus' behavior is proposed by Campbell Bonner, who suggests that in the account of the raising of Lazarus, the statement should be, that's a whole lot of Greek text, however, should be translated as, the spirit set him in frenzy and he threw himself into disorder. Bonner adds that the phrase in verse 38 seems to mean in suppressed or inward frenzy. I would suggest, however, that interpreting this Greek text, as indicative of possession, frenzy ignores the sense of anger and indignation that is associated with the term. For example, Arndt and Gingrich interpret as to snort with anger and propose that we should interpret the word as an expression of anger and displeasure. It appears that the presence of the term within this passage simply serves to indicate that Jesus was angry and does not signify that he was exhibiting motor hyperexcitement or any other physical manifestation of possession frenzy. If we are to recognize that the historical Jesus was subject to periods of spirit possession and that he was exhibiting all the characteristic symptoms of a possessed individual, then we would expect to find evidence within the Gospels of an initial possession experience in which Jesus first encounters his possessing spirit. Stephen Davies suggests that the Gospel writers record this event and that it takes place at Jesus' baptism in the Jordan. The baptism as the moment of spirit possession. The bizarre imagery of the descent of a dove and a voice coming from the heavens that are used by the gospel authors when describing Jesus' baptism in the Jordan are found nowhere else in the Gospels, and they are generally considered to be a poetic vehicle through which the gospel authors present a messianic moment, make revelations regarding Jesus' divine identity, and highlight his relationship with God. Stephen Davies claims that since the baptismal accounts provided by the gospel authors meet John Mayer's criterion of multiple attestation, the story appears in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The criterion of embarrassment, the story is not compatible with the interests of early Christianity. And the criterion of dissimilarity, there is no mention of the descending Holy Spirit in other Jewish or early Christian sources. The baptism accounts can therefore be considered to be a historically reliable record of events. Davies then suggests that the baptism accounts essentially describe Jesus' initial spirit possession experience. This adoptionist added possession theory proposes that Jesus was not possessed by the Spirit prior to his baptism, and that he underwent a psychological transformation during which he was anointed with the power to begin his messianic work. To regard the baptism as the moment of the endowment of spiritual power is reminiscent of the first century Gnostic doctrine of Cyrenaianism and the second century sect of the Ebionites, both of whom believed that Jesus did not have the Holy Spirit until his baptism and that it abandoned him at the crucifixion. A number of difficulties, my dear esteemed viewer, arise when proposing that the historical Jesus was spirit possessed, and these will be addressed forthwith. However, connotations of spirit possession may account for the sensitive treatment of the baptismal account by each of the gospel authors. The author of Matthew was previously explained that Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and therefore he does not require the baptism story to explain the presence of the Holy Spirit in Jesus' ministry. Nevertheless, the baptismal account is preserved in Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 through 17. The author of Luke separates Jesus' baptism from the descent of the Spirit and the heavenly voice, preferring to introduce these later when Jesus is praying. The author of John chooses to replicate the baptismal story, but he is clearly embarrassed by it since he turns it into a vision by John the Baptist. Various attempts have been made to account for the appearance of the Spirit as a dove in all four Gospels. One particularly persuasive explanation is that the Gospel authors are conforming the physical embodiment of God's Spirit to the popular conception of spirits or souls as airy, bird-like entities. James Fraser observes that it was widely accepted in the ancient world that when a person died, his soul would leave his body in bird shape, and he adds that this conception has probably left traces in most languages, and it lingers as a metaphor in poetry. In concurrence with Fraser's comments, the depiction of the spirit or soul of the deceased as a bird is common in biblical, classical, and modern literature. For example, James L. Allen Jr. writes in his study of the bird soul motif in the writings of William Butler Yeats. Get behind me, Satan, and your frequency attack. Thank you, Freya. Because of its ability to rise above the earth, a bird is a fairly obvious and appropriate symbol for a disembodied soul. The identification of soul with bird is both ancient and widespread. The naturalness of such an association no doubt underlying its universality. There are various passages from classical literature in which the soul leaves the body in the form of a bird, and one example of the early Christian use of this imagery is found in the martyrdom of Polycarp, in which the saint's soul leaves his body in the form of a dove upon death. I quote, "So at length, the lawless men, seeing that his body could not be consumed by the fire, ordered an executioner to go up to him and stab him with a dagger. And when he had done this, there came forth a dove and a quantity of blood." Although it is possible that the gospel authors adopted the simple literary device of a bird soul as a means by which to represent the physical embodiment of the Spirit, other scholars have suggested that this term is an error in translation and that the word relates to the manner in which the Spirit descends. Regardless of whether the gospel authors intended this term to indicate a physical dove or simply the Spirit's mode of descent, a theory of spirit possession would be greatly strengthened if the gospel writers intended to portray this Spirit as entering into Jesus following its descent, rather than simply resting upon him. The connection between possession and the presence of a spirit within the individual is demonstrated in the Markan account of the Capernaum demoniac. When the unclean spirit is said to be in the possessed man, certainly this is indwelling nature of the Holy Spirit is suggested in the baptismal account provided in the Ebionite gospel, in which the dove comes down and enters into Jesus. However, I would suggest that the terminology used by the gospel authors cannot be used as a reliable indicator of spirit possession, since the terms upon and in are used interchangeably when depicting the reception of the Spirit in the Old Testament. For example, Esau in Isaiah chapter 42:1, it reads, verse 1, "I have put my spirit upon him." Whereas in Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 27 reads, "And I will put my spirit within you." Since Jesus' wilderness experience follows directly from his baptism in all three synoptic gospels, it is clear that the evangelists intend the two events to be linked together. With this in mind, Stefan Davies suggests that Jesus' expulsion into the wilderness is a direct result of his prior gift of the Spirit at baptism, and that the forceful nature of Jesus' departure is reminiscent of the impulsive behavior associated with the possessed. Therefore, Davies proposes that the gospel authors are describing a spontaneous possession experience. The forcefulness of Jesus' expulsion is evident in the terminology used in the Markan account, while Matthew and Luke employ the much softer terminologies. A forceful, violent external influence upon Jesus is evident, in which the Spirit forcefully drives out Jesus into the wilderness. My dear esteemed viewer, court will take a brief recession. And I don't want any of you to run off out into the wilderness. I want you to girdle up your spiritual loins. I want you to embolden your resilience and stand fast in the harness, because we will continue. This court will continue. And we are going to, in the process, elevate our divine gnosis, and we will transcend this archon matrix of lies. You have my assurances. If you hit that subscribe button, we will get through this, and we will do so in the manner that was spoken of in the great Bhagavad Gita, as Arjuna and Krishna, as they battled the forces of evil, Maya, ignorance, illusion. We, this court of law, shall adjudicate much in the same manner, adjudicate as Solomon the wise.
Namaste, namaskaram.